that we have the basic functionality of our app working, what we want to work on now is making it easier to configure the different options we might want to have for our app. So I am in my project folder and I have issued the npm run dev command. So in my browser, here is where we left off with our app. And a few things right offhand that we might want to configure are, what should the default axis color be? What should the default background color be for our plane? What should the default point color be? And another thing we talked about in our last video is making it so that our curves aren't as spaced out. We might want these to look much more continuous than they do, as opposed to just a series of disconnected dots. And the idea as we start working with these configuration items is we want to make sure that these values are not spread out across the different components of our app. We'd like to make one central file where all of our configuration goes, and then we'll use props of our various components to override these default configuration values. So let's go back into our code and we'll open up our main app.vue file. And let's make this as simple as possible. We're going to get rid of all this content here, and we really just want to strip this down to a basic set of axes and go from there. So let's even get rid of our V model here. We can get rid of our dependency on curve and point for now. Again, we might be adding these later, but we just want to simplify things as much as possible. So we can even get rid of our X value and our two computed properties. Okay, so if we save that up, go back to our browser, there we go. That's a little more stripped down, and that's a good place to start when we want to make a big change like we're about to do. Now, if you'll recall, we had a file here called main.js, and this is sort of where we're setting our app up. So right here, let's go ahead and we're just going to import our configuration object. And we're going to create this file here in just a second, and we're going to call it plainview.config.js. And let's go ahead and create this file here. So new file, plainview.config.js. And inside of here, we're going to export an object, and that is what we will be receiving when we import config from that file. So the first thing we might want to put in our config here is axis color. So again, we're thinking of this as the default axis color. This doesn't have to be the color of every axis that's ever created through this app. It's just going to be the color that gets set if we don't specify one in the first place. I think that black is a good default choice, but for now, let's go ahead and say orange, since we want to make sure that this is working. And having it change color to orange is a good way visually to verify that that's working. Okay, and back in our main.js file, we don't want to have to import this config within every component that needs it, because we basically assume that all components are going to use this config object. So let's go ahead and just set a global variable, and we'll name it something pretty specific so that we're not making it too generic. And we're just going to set that equal to config. And now from within any of our components, we can just refer to the variable plainViewConfig, and that will give us our configuration object. And since the axis color has to do with the axis component, let's go into our axis component here, and let's see where we might insert that config object. Now, if we hunt down where the color black is listed within our component, we can scroll down and see that it's just hard-coded in this CSS here as the background color of our axis container. So let's take this out for now, and we need to use our JavaScript now to make this dynamic. So recall that when your component has data that needs to be dynamic, a good place to put that is in a computed property. So we could make a computed property called color, and We're not actually going to end up doing that. The reason why is because this doesn't give the ability for parent components to pass in their own values to override the color. So instead of a computed property, if we want this to be something that a parent could pass in to our axis component, we need to make that a prop. So let's go ahead and call this color. And we'll say that the type should be string, and the default should be the value of our plain Vue config. Now remember, this is a global variable that we've created, so we can just reference it as is. And we want to call the axis color there. And so if we don't pass in a prop to our axis component, it's just going to take on the default value of whatever is set in our config. Now, of course, this hasn't applied the color anywhere. It's just allowing it to be populated. What we need to do here is to add a style binding and say that for our background color, we have the value of the prop color. So that was a lot of changes there. Let's save that up and go back to our browser. And sure enough, we can see that our color is now orange. And if we go back into our config and we change that to purple, we see that, oops, it looks like something has broken here. So let's open up our console. And we have plain Vue config is not defined. So it looks like there's a problem with our global variable that we've set up. I think what that might mean is our default needs to be, let's actually make it a function so that anytime the value needs to be updated, that can happen. And if we save that and head over, yeah, that will work. So typically with props that are strings, we do not need a function to define a default. But it seems that when our default is dynamic, we do need to have a function there. Okay, and just to test this one more time, let's go into our config, turn this to green, save it, and there we go. We have green axes. So of course we don't want to force this color to always take precedent. So let's turn this back to black for the default. And then within our app file, we can go ahead and pass in a color. And we'll leave our y-axis as black just to distinguish those. And this should make it so that our axis component receives the value of green instead of going to the default. So if we head back to our browser, there we go. We have green for the x-axis and black for the y-axis. Okay, so let's go ahead and now that we know that's working, let's change this so that we know that we can change the color if we want, but for now we'll just go with the default of black. And that's the basic idea for our configuration here. We're just taking all of the options we might want to vary and putting those in one file here, as opposed to letting these values be spread out across our different components. So next, let's bring in a point here. And we're going to need to import that and also put it here in our components. And let's just see what that gives us. Okay, so it just assumes that it's going to be at 0, 0, and its color is black. And if we inspect this with our Vue DevTools, we can see we have a point here, and it has a prop color whose value is black. And it looks like those defaults we put in place of 0 and 0 are working out for us just fine. So let's go ahead and make a default point color. And again, this is eventually just going to be black because that seems the most straightforward. But for now, we're going to make it something very noticeable like, I don't know, red. So this will just make sure that our code is working. And since we are working with the point color here, let's go into point.view. And we've already got a prop color here. So it looks like the only thing we need to do is set this to our config dot point color, and then we should be all set. So if we go and load that up, sure enough, we get a red point. And if we go back into our app, we can override that if we want by saying, you know what, instead of the default, we're going to use something like purple. So that changes the point to purple. Okay, so after we do a few of these, it starts to be a little more routine. We're going to just change this back to black for the default, since that makes the most sense. So we'll get rid of our override there. And next, let's put a default point size in place, since that might be something that we want to be configurable. So we'll go back into our config, and let's just make another one called plain point size, and we'll set that to 5 pixels. I believe that's the value we currently have. And we're not going to change that to something different just yet. If you recall, this 5 pixels was involved in a CSS calculation, so we want to be pretty careful with that. And if we go back into our point component, let's look at where that 5 pixels came into play. So we have a width and a height here, and those are determining the size of the point. And in our positioning values here, the X and Y calculated values that determine where in the plane a point is going to sit, we had hard-coded this value of 5 pixels over 2, and that corresponds with our width and height of 5 pixels. And in fact, we had made a to-do here to add some configuration to make this more adjustable. So to do, make the 5 pixel width and scale of 10 to be adjustable. In fact, this is an error. The scale is actually 25. So scaling is something we're going to get to in just a little bit, but for now, we're just going to work on the width and height. So let's go ahead and take these away now, since we know that we're about to do these. Now, we did not have the concept of adjustable width and height before, so we need to go ahead and make props for those. We'll say that the width has a type of string, and the default should be given by our config value. And we'll do the same for our height. Notice one thing here, we're not really assuming that we're ever going to have a different width and height, because points really, technically they don't have any width and height. We just have to add those so that we can see them. And it doesn't make much sense to have a point that is not circular shaped. Like, we wouldn't want to have an elliptical point or anything like that. Points are always represented as essentially dots, which are circles. So we're going to make a new prop and just call this size. And this will be a prop whose type is string and whose default is going to be given by our config object, like so. Okay, so if we want to replace this CSS here that's been hard-coded, we can add some style rules here to our style binding, and we're going to say that the width should be the value of size, and the height should also be the value of size. And of course, those are both referring to the size prop here. And finally, we can take away this 5 pixels, and since we're in the middle of a string literal, we can just insert our value here, and we want to say this dot size, and here we want to say this dot size. So let's first go to our browser and make sure that that did not break anything. If all went well, we shouldn't really see anything change, which it looks like we didn't. We have a point here. We can now see the size prop set to 5 pixels, so that looks like it is perfectly receiving the config value. And also our calculations also have the 5 pixels there. So let's just see what happens now if we go into our config and we say, I don't want it to be 5 pixels anymore, I want it to be 10 pixels. Well, there we go. It looks a little bit big and ridiculous, but that is a 10 pixel point there. And if we wanted to make it smaller, like say 3 pixels, That's no problem. It's a little bit harder to see there. In fact, I can't really see that at all because of the axes. But if we look in our point component here, we can see that it is receiving those values just fine. So let's set this back to 5 pixels. And again, that's just the default. If we go back to our app, we should be able to say, you know what, I want to change this size for this one point to be 8 pixels. And we could have another point using our color prop and our size prop just to distinguish here. Let's say this one should be red. Let's say that this one should actually just inherit the default size. And let's say that the X coordinate here should be 1 and the Y coordinate should be -3. So that gives us plenty to test that all of our configuration is working here. And sure enough, we have a bigger point at the origin since we didn't specify any coordinates. And we have a smaller red point here whose coordinates are 1, -3. And now that we've got the basics covered with our axes and our points, let's revisit our relation and curve components and make sure that those are implementing our point configuration properly. So back in our app, let's replace both of these points with a relation. And if you recall, a relation is just a container for a set of points. And this is a more general version of a curve. We think of a curve as a connected continuous relation, whereas a relation can really just be any old scattered set of points that you like. And the idea that we had here is that each relation should essentially have the same point size and point color to indicate that all the points belong to that particular relation. So let's go and we'll just change this to relation here. And we need to give our relation a set of points to work with. So we'll say points equals, and that should be an array. And each item of the array should also be an array, which would represent an X and Y coordinate. So let's say that we want a point at 0, 0, which is the origin. And we want another point at 1, -1. And we want another point at -1, 2. So let's save that and make sure that it's all working like we think. And that's looking good. 0, 0, 1, -1, and -1, 2. And we have it set up so that our relation can accept a color prop. So we could say purple, and these would all change to purple. What we don't have working right now is our relation doesn't know what the default point color is. So to illustrate that, let's take away our color prop. Let's go back into our config and say again that the point color should be something different like orange. And it just doesn't know that it should be orange, it just makes itself black. So why might that be? Well, if we look in our relation component here, let's see what we have going on. We are receiving a color, but the default is just hard-coded to be black here. So again, we can just pull in our config object and say that this should be point color as the default. And there we go. We get orange, which is set in our config to be the default. So now if we go back into our app component, we could overwrite that now if we want and say, you know what, make it purple. And there we have purple points. So that's looking good. And we also don't have the size prop here. So we want to say something like size equals 8 pixels. And of course that has no effect here yet because our relation component doesn't know anything about the size. So if we go into our relation component, we need to tell it to expect a size prop. And this is again going to be type string, and the default is just going to be given by our config point size. And now this still isn't quite complete because our relation is responsible for putting its own points in place. And so our relation needs to tell it what point size we should have. So we'll go ahead and just say size should be the value of size, and this is going to make sure that the correct value gets passed into our point component. So there we have 8 pixels, and again that's because in our app we told it to be 8 pixels. We could do 12 if we wanted them to be even bigger, and if we go back to our config, we again have the default of 5 pixels. So if we take this away totally, we are going to just fall back to that default of 5 pixels. And the last thing we want to do is just make sure that our curve component is working well. If you recall, curves are going to extend the relation component, so some of what we just did could also affect our curve component here. So let's go ahead and change these values back. And we need to give our curve some points here. So if you recall, these can be dynamic. And I want to create a data property here. Like before, we had one called X value and one called Y value. That will be fine for our purposes here. And we just need to make those values here. So X value, let's set that to 0. And if you recall, our Y value actually is a function of X. So what we can do here is make this a computed property, and we'll just say return this dot X value. And let's just do, how about Y equals X squared? So we're going to say power of X to the second, and that should give us a curve. If you recall, we had a little input here before, so we're going to just recreate that and say that the V model this is based on is X value. And so that'll change the value of our X, which should in turn change the value of our Y. And instead of a type text, let's have type number. And we basically just want to check that everything's still working here before we go any further. And it looks like something broke. So what did we do wrong here? Looks like we might have a typo here, possibly for our points. So we have our curve, and this needs to have quotes around it. And that's what our problem was. So if we refresh now, looks like we still have an error. So what are we doing now? Active point is null. So that just means that we have actually misused our own curve component here. We should have this active point, and we don't actually need to have a points prop here. We can just have an active point. So hopefully that fixed us up here, and that's looking better. If we change this now, do we go in a parabola? Yes, we do. Noticing we got another error here. So it looks like our prop has the wrong type. For X, it expected a number but got a string, and that actually just means our V model is passing in a string where we really want it to pass in a number. So hopefully this finally gives us everything we need, and that looks better. So we're graphing a parabola here, y equals x squared, and the color is orange, which means that our relation component is doing its thing there. Of course, we still have in our config orange as the default point color. So without us really doing any extra work, our curve just inherited that default color from our relation component. So if we flip back, we have red and so on. So let's look into our curve component and see what's going on there. It looks like for our points here, we're passing in a prop value of color. And notice that we don't have a color prop here. And that's where our curve component is relying on the fact that it extends the relation component, which does have a color prop. So that one just came for free. We get our curve obeying the default point color because our relation component is doing so. And the very last thing let's do here, remember we had this thing called active color, which essentially lets us know what our model is pointing to currently. So right now we're at x equals -2, which is over here. If we push up 1, we're at x equals -1, and then our active point becomes this one. So that's just a way for us to trace which point we're on as we go up and down in x value. So let's go ahead and make a config property for that active point color. If we come back in here, we have point color, point size. Let's just go ahead and make active point color. And we will right now set this to green just to make sure it is working. And our curve component is really the only thing that has the concept of an active point. A relation is just a static set of points that's not moving in any way, so having an active point doesn't really make sense there. So let's go back into our curve component, and we're going to go ahead and make a prop called active. Actually, we already have that, active color, and it's set to a default of gray. So let's just change that to our config property there. And if we save that and check that it's working, remember that the active color doesn't take place until after you move the curve for the first time. So there we go, our active point is now green and all of our other points are red. So this is looking pretty good. We're going to go back in here and let's just change this back to gray like we had it. And these are very boring defaults, but that's kind of the idea. You don't want them to be something outrageous. You want these to be really normal values that are kind of generic, and then we can override those on a case-by-case basis if we want. So loading this up one last time, we can move our point around and everything's looking great, and everything's configurable without having to go into multiple files and finding all these values and changing them. So this is really just the beginning of our configuration process. What we have now is a system that's going to work going forward. As we find new things that we want to be configurable, we can just add them into our configuration file, and we'll make sure that we have all of our options in one place.